Welcome to Own the Potential podcast, where we explore the freedom and power of taking personal responsibility for our current state of affairs. By listening to those who've done it, we'll learn the practical steps of overcoming the odds. Quite simply, you are the creator of your life, not the reflection of your history. I'm your host, Michael Jasilowitz Jr., otherwise known as MJ. Let's see where this goes. Welcome to the first podcast, Own the Potential. I really do understand there are many options, so I just want to say how much I appreciate you taking the time to listen. All the people out there that are friends and family or new people, new listeners to me, I really do appreciate it. So before we get into the transformational work of others, I think it's only fair you learn a little bit about me and what events got me to this point in my life. Today, I'm a transformational coach. I work with entrepreneurs, executives, and athletes to remove whatever obstacles appear in their lives. Whether it's a golfer who's in a slump or an executive who's looking for fulfillment in their job, I enjoy being of service to overcome the blocks that stand in their way and their idea of success. But that's really not where I began. My first job was on a pig farm, shoveling pig manure up to my knees and weeding pumpkin fields. And for anybody who's ever worked with pumpkins and pumpkin plants, you can attest to this. There's a bunch of little pricklies on there. And by the end of the day, after hours of working in the sun, your hands are pretty swollen. And it can be difficult work. So any farm hands out there, I'm one of those people that grew up. I did it for a few years in the summertime. It was great extra money and it was an amazing work experience. But needless to say, it was backbreaking work. And although rewarding, I kind of knew pretty quickly that that wasn't my calling in life. So before that, I was a walker in grammar school. Those are the people who live really close to the school. And we would walk to school. It's so infrequent that you see that nowadays. I still see it in Europe and other places, and maybe some towns in America, but we were a block away. So we walked to school every single day, whether it rained or it snowed, it didn't matter. So growing up in that area north of Boston, we were used to that New England weather, and we kept ourselves busy no matter what the weather had in store. We had to be creative. So on my way to school, I'd stop at Sam's Corner Store and get some gum and Garbage Pail Kids, if y'all remember those, and baseball cards. And the kids taking the bus didn't have this type of access to the store, so I learned quickly that people were willing to pay a premium for things they didn't have access to. This was my first lesson in supply and demand. What I would do is I'd buy a pack of Hubba Bubba that had 5 pieces of gum for 25 cents, and I'd sell each piece for a dime, doubling my money. I'd also trade the cards until I had entire sets that I sold, doubling my money there as well. This was really my first venture as an entrepreneur, and it kept me cash flowing from about 1st to 6th grade. And then I got a job as a dishwasher for my parents' friend, Paul. He had a place called the Push Cart, and it was a sweet job because I was one of 3 guys with all women. Most of them were high school girls, and they treated me like a brother. Paul, he treated me like a son. He taught me how to be an entrepreneur. He was up early to go to the farmer's market to buy produce for the Push Cart and produce for this new salad bar we had and his produce distribution business. And then he would come in and he would run the store until close, about 7 p.m., and I'd watch him and his hard work and his dedication, and he shared his strategy every now and then. He'd tell me a little bit about the accounting and how the profit margin worked, and I didn't mind the hard work. Actually, I really admired his lifestyle. Paul was never flamboyant. He was just full of excitement and passion. And while having freedom to make his own choices, I really liked that. Because my parents, they were both employees. At one point, my dad had his own concrete business, but it didn't last. He launched a few other businesses through the years, but they never really got off the ground. It wasn't really for the lack of trying, but really the lack of experience and guidance. So when my dad said to me, "Learn from my mistakes," I did. I realized early on that I needed a mentor. And if I was going to make it as an entrepreneur, I needed to learn from someone who was successful at it. So after the Push Cart, I went and worked at Pizza Mia. And although I learned at the Push Cart, I was learning dishwashing, food prep, stocking, customer service, the register. Pizza Mia was open later in the evening, and there were only guys working there, which is a whole other story. But the owners were 2 young guys. One was going to be going back to law school, and he was making some money while he was waiting. And the other was a career pizza man with a high school education. And I witnessed firsthand how education level was meaningless in gauging the success of an entrepreneur. Mike might have had a high school education, but he went on to own multiple pizza locations and a distribution for his homemade pizza sauce. So these guys worked hard, and they taught the rest of us who were willing to listen along the way. So after all that, I badly wanted to be a business owner, but I didn't want to borrow and lose money like I saw with my dad. And so all my closest friends, they were going to go the traditional route to college. And, I finished top of my class. I was like number 12 out of 220, I think. And although I wanted to go to college, I had other things going on at home, and I just really wanted to get away. So I decided to go into the Air Force. And right before I decided to do that, I grew up playing soccer. It was that was the sport that I did a lot of sports growing up, and I was always an athlete, and I loved to go out and run and exert my energy and figure things out. But soccer, as I got older, was the only sport that I kept playing, and we played year round. So after our high school season in the fall, we would always play indoor. In the winter, it's New England. And then in the spring, we would play a traveling team. And all of my friends and I, we all grew up playing together since we were, 6, 7, 8 years old. So by the time we reached 14, 15, 16, 17, we were a solid unit. Everyone played together exceptionally well. So anyways, we were playing on our traveling team. We were playing the town next to us. And I had just had so much going on. I was so frustrated that my parents were arguing. My dad was an alcoholic. They split up a number of times. And I was just, I don't know. My girlfriend broke up with me. She dumped me. And things just, I didn't know what the hell I wanted. And I was hurt. I didn't know how to deal with the emotions. I didn't have a father figure to really walk me through that stuff. So the closest thing I had to a father figure was my coach. He started the soccer program in our town when I was like 3. So I've been playing since, no joke. I started playing soccer when I was about 3.5. And so he knew me since I was a child, and he knew my dad, and he knew the situation. And so we're on the soccer field this day. We're beating the team by like 5, 6 points. We're lined up I was a center midfielder, or I was a midfielder. So we were lined up on the line for kickoff. And the kid in the other team, they were frustrated because they were losing. And he just kept talking trash, and I wasn't in a good place. And he kept saying it. He was a little bit shorter than me. And he kept getting in my face until finally I just headbutted him, and he fell back. I don't know if he got knocked out or whatever, but mayhem ensued. Everyone started coming at me. Someone grabbed me from behind. I'm just kicking and swinging. I was just letting out every bit of frustration that I had. Needless to say, I was kicked out of the game and ultimately kicked out of the league. And so I don't even know to this day if, I think that still stands. I would have to go through something to be reinitiated if I would want to coach. But anyways, the point is I was really frustrated at that time. And my coach that I grew up with, he was there and he saw it and he just let me go. But the following week, it was in the last month or so of school. The following week, he said, let's sit down and talk. What happened last week? We need to talk about that. I didn't want to, because one of the things that I'm really good at, especially at that time, was being not vulnerable, opening up my heart. Why? Girlfriend just dumped me, broke my heart. My dad wasn't around, I was an alcoholic. My mom and dad are always arguing, and everyone in our house screamed all the time. There was love there, don't get me wrong, but there was a lot of dysfunction. And I didn't know, I didn't know what I didn't know. And so at the time, we went in, and I put up that wall, and I wouldn't let him in. And we talked for a while until finally he got through to me. And he pretty much said, we're going to sit here and we're going to talk, and until you realize that it doesn't matter your past. Your potential is what you want to put into it. And you have all the potential in the world. You just have to realize that. So he said, we're going to stay here until you admit that, until I see that you accept that. And there were a lot of tears shed, and he stood up for me like a man never had. He stood up, and he put me in my place and said, you need to take responsibility for the actions you took last week, and whatever actions that you decide to take today, and each time you make a decision, it's your responsibility. He told me about that. He's the one who taught me about that. So at that point, that was the first time. It wasn't only the first time that someone stood up for me like that. It was the first time I realized it, and it's always that has always remained with me since that day in 1992. So and that's what it was. It was 1992. I decided to go in the Air Force, and remember The Berlin Wall had just come down. Clinton was just about to be elected. And only a year before, Operation Desert Storm was a success and the world was at peace. So I thought, you know what? I'll get out of here. I'll be able to travel with the military. I'll get my degree paid for while serving, and I'll retire in my 30s and do something else as a business owner. But, one of the things that I realized were, at the time, both my grandfathers were dead before I was ever born. So the one thing that stood out, though, was the story of my great-grandfather. It always intrigued me. He emigrated from Europe after being gassed in World War I, and then he found his way to this large Polish community in Cambridge, Mass. That's where he met his wife, and then eventually him and his family, they made their way 20 miles north to Tewksbury, Mass., where I grew up, and they owned hundreds of acres of land for community camping, family fun. And so, although I never met him, he was one of the first stories that excited me about overcoming the odds. He was one of the first inspirational stories that I had, and he was my blood. He's the one who left. He left all that persecution that he was dealing with in Europe at the time, and he came to America. So, come to find out, he was forced into the military, into the army by the Russians, and then he was gassed while in combat. And after that, his brother and his sister, they joined him. They left Europe. His sister went to Chicago, and his brother went south to Argentina. We didn't find that part out until Facebook came along. I mean, how cool is that? Talk about, side note, how cool is it that, you can say whatever you want about Facebook, but we were introduced to an entire side of our family that we never knew existed. And that's how, that was one of the ways that we found out that his brother went down there. We had to pull it out of one of our great aunts before she passed. And she was like, oh yeah, this is what happened. It's crazy. So anyways, my great grandfather, with practically nothing in his pocket, he came here, he learned the language, and then he started a business as a carpenter. He purchased the land and he raised a family. And without ever meeting him, he inspired me by doing that. That was the legacy that he left. And that was, but I didn't find that out so much later. But when I heard the stories when I was younger about coming to America and not knowing the language and building all this, man, I was like, what happened to our family? Why didn't that continue? And, there's a lot of reasons for that, but that just, that didn't continue through the years. And I wanted to change that. So for me, I went in the Air Force, and it was an amazing experience. I actually worked in, I wanted to go in, I went in for Special Forces. That's what I always had wanted to do. I saw the movie Heartbreak Ridge and, all these movies back then. And I got into amazing shape. And then when I went in, I failed my eye test for a few times. I failed my eye test 3 times. And they're like, sorry, you can't, you got to choose an admin job. So I went in, I chose an admin job. And then fortunately, I had some great leadership. And because it was a peaceful time, a lot of people took this early retirement. And here I was, 17, 18 years old, becoming a resident expert on computer systems when the Gateway 512s were just coming out. The world of computers was really changing. The internet was just starting to get noticed. And I got put into a leadership role because people were getting out at 15 years. Someone had to run the place, right? We still had some leadership there, but I was given responsibilities that I shouldn't have had for a few more years. So I got to learn a lot about accounting and finance. I worked in accounting and finance. I got to learn about contracts. I got to learn about military pay. And then I got to work in the general's building during our exercises. And it was such a fun time. And fortunately for me, I was able to win the Airman of the Year, and it was an amazing honor. I represented our squadron, and I was just one of a few people who ended up winning that. And it was an honor, absolute honor. So after the military, I was in, and because it was a peacetime and I didn't get to do my special forces, after almost 3 years, I was like, I want to get out a year early. And I had this thing called Palace Chase, so I was able to get out a year early. And I wanted to be an actor, because I started acting in the Air Force. So I acted, and I was going to school at UMass, and everything was great. And while I was going to school, I was a server, and I just kept falling back in love with this restaurant thing, And as with anybody my age, it was my dreams, desires, they just kept changing so rapidly. But what I found out is I had little guidance, but restaurants, they just kept coming back into my life, and I knew I wanted to own one. So at that point,